Good morning everyone, and welcome to the Groundsure webinar in association with BACTEC on Unexploded Ordnance. My name is Fraser Stokes and I head up the Insights team here at Groundsure. You may or may not be aware that we're one of the leading due diligence and environmental data providers in the country, providing information on land and property from everything from flood risks to contaminated land risk and much more as well. We also partner with specialist organisations such as BACTEC, who are one of the leading experts in the country on unexploded ordnance. Before I hand over to Philip Norville, our presenter for the day, who's going to talk us through UXO risk mitigation, I'll give you a brief introduction to Philip. He's got over 20 years experience as a civil engineer and recently moved to BACTEC to head up their team in the unexploded ordnance space. The presentation that you're about to hear should be around about 45 minutes long, and to the right hand side of your screen you'll see a box that gives you the opportunity to submit questions under the chat feature. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, do submit them, because at the end we'll be answering some of those questions if we have time, and you'll have the opportunity, as I say, to submit some thoughts. Furthermore, the session will be recorded, so you can share that with any colleagues that you have who may not have been able to attend the session itself. You can also revisit it when you receive an email after the event with a link to the recording. One final thing, we'll be sending a questionnaire to request feedback, because we really do value the feedback that we get from these webinars. Any advice or structure or tips or suggestions that you feel would improve our next webinars, or even some compliments, will be very welcome, and we look forward to improving and structuring the webinars in future. So Philip, I'll now hand over to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction, Fraser. It's good to be here again. This is the second time we've run this session in partnership with Groundsure, and it's particularly appropriate today, the day before Armistice Day. Why can't I change the slides? I'm just having a slight technical problem here. Just please bear with me a moment. Okay, so Dynasafe BACTEC have been operating in the UK for just over 25 years. We were originally set up by the commanding officer of the Army's bomb squad upon him retiring from the armed forces. We mainly specialise in the UK construction industry, but also we have a full marine capability, so we can get involved with offshore and nearshore projects, and we also work in post-conflict zones such as Iraq and Afghanistan, clearing IEDs, clearing minefields, and we're currently out in the Falkland Islands for the Ministry of Defence, clearing up the last of the minefields left from the conflict in the early 80s. So why is UXO something that the construction industry needs to think about in the current market? Unexploded ordnance ultimately is designed to detonate, and the intention of the detonation may be to kill personnel, it may be to cause significant injuries, maim, or it may be to destroy assets, and that could be by means of explosions, it could be by setting fires, it could even include chemical weapons. The likelihood of accidentally detonating UXO, unexploded ordnance, is low, but the construction industry does contribute a lot of sort of activities that could generate these kind of situations: heavy plant, piling, excavation, those kind of things. If any ordnance is detonated, even a small item such as a hand grenade or a mortar shell, the consequences can be very serious. The worst case scenario, death, injuries, or significant delays financially to projects, which may not be as immediately traumatic but can be significant to anybody involved with the project. Because of these consequences, under the CDM regs, unexploded ordnance would remain as a potentially significant risk. Therefore, it should be considered on any project where you believe there's even a chance of it being present, and then the risk should be evaluated, managed and mitigated. So this is a slide that took literally a few moments to create, and these are all articles for ordnance finds in 2016. The good thing relating to these press cuttings is it's mainly about chaos that's being caused to commuters, it's roads having to be closed, it's temporary cordons put in place. The good thing is there's no deaths, no serious injuries recorded in the press. It's very rare that the national press gets involved. It's usually local regional press. So again, if you're sort of looking at a project in an area, a quick Google search around the local newspaper, local press cuttings may expose something. And as you can see there, it's an area that covers the whole of the country. We've got Rampion Wind Farm off the coast of Brighton, we've got Victoria Station in London, we've got unexploded shells in Liverpool, 2 recent finds in Sheffield on the IKEA site that's being built there, a bomb found in Bath, Cambridge, York, so it really is something that's affecting the whole country. We often get feedback, we're not working in London, we're not working in Southampton, I don't need to consider it, but as you will see, these are finds across the whole of the country. This is our most recent find that did generate a lot of press. A lot of our activities go unreported, and certainly a lot of clients like to minimise publicity associated with finding ordnance for whatever reasons they have. This was a 500 kilo bomb found in Bath, and this was found 1 metre under a playground of a school that was being refurbished. The contractor had approached us at the initial stages of the project saying he knew the area had been bombed during the Second World War, could we undertake some research? And we found the bomb in the area that we predicted it would be, albeit shallower than we expected. A 500 kilo bomb hitting the ground at 260 meters a second usually goes down to maybe up to 10 meters deep. This instance found very, very shallow, within about a meter of the surface. We found this on the Thursday night. We called the bomb squad in. The bomb squad took over the site at 10 o'clock the following morning, removed the fusing mechanism, made the item safe before removing it for a controlled detonation in a local quarry. So as I've mentioned, this is an impact across the whole country. London was by far the most heavily bombed city during the Second World War, but all these other cities again were all heavily bombed, and dependent how you rank them, and that could be number of tons of ordnance dropped, number of raids, percentage of properties that were damaged. Some of those cities will move up and down in the rankings there. So places like Liverpool, Southampton, very heavily bombed. You know, they actually had more ordnance dropped on them maybe on some of the other cities in the list. And again, this is a heat map showing where the main bombs were dropped in the Second World War. And as you can see, again, it really is covering pretty much the whole of England, and then Scotland, the main population centre through the Central Belt, and some of the areas around the coast where both airfields and naval bases were during the time of the war. So a lot of people consider on their projects whether the site was bombed during the war, but also, in particular in the First World War, a little bit in the Second World War, battleships, heavy cruisers would park off the coast in the channel, even go up river estuaries, and they could fire shells up to 20-30 miles inland. And as well as the enemy activities, we also undertook area denial and home defence activities to defend ourselves. So that may have included an anti-aircraft gun, it may have included things like barrage balloons, it may have included the Home Guard being armed with various items. During the Second World War, at the start of the war, it was estimated that 10% of all items dropped and 10% of our defensive ordnance didn't detonate. And as the war progressed, due to the heavy demands, the quality control deteriorated, and by the end of the war it's estimated that maybe 1 in 3 items didn't perform as intended. So worth considering. Also, The UK land has been heavily used for military training. In the Second World War, it's estimated that 50% of the UK land at some point had some military activity on it. And although the MOD has recently been selling off land, they still own a significant amount of the UK land, and a lot of exercises are conducted with live ordnance and live rounds. And then in addition to this, a lot of munitions were dumped. Particularly at the end of the Second World War, we didn't have the manpower and the capability to recover all the items from defensive positions. So instructions included dig a hole, bury the items at least 6 feet deep. Record keeping related to these dumped items varies. In some places we've got very good records, in some places there are no records whatsoever. And then you get accidental disposal. It could be people moving from one location to another and a shell falls off the back of a trailer. It could be falls out of the pocket or the rucksack of a military person, and also things like poor working practice. Again, at some of the manufacturing facilities, things that didn't pass quality control was often just stockpiled at the edge of the site, maybe with the intention of removal later, which sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. So what is ordnance? Ordnance covers everything from a bullet that you would put in a gun through to the heaviest of the bombs dropped by an aircraft. It includes things like mortars, it includes tank rounds, and the picture there is a 250 kilo air-dropped bomb from the Luftwaffe. That made up approximately 10% of everything that was dropped on the UK in the Second World War, and it was its smaller brother, the 50 kilo bomb, that actually made up about 80 to 90% of everything that was dropped. And then the larger bombs going up to about 1.8 tons made up a very small percentage of ordnance. As a company, we typically find 3 or 4 of these items a year on construction projects across the UK, and then small items that the Allied forces may have used, such as landmines, mortars, hand grenades, small arms rounds. We typically find at least 1 item of those a week somewhere in the UK. This is an incendiary bomb, again something that was very heavily dropped on the UK during the war. These items didn't have much ground penetration capability. The idea is they would land on the surface, they would then ignite, and they contained phosphorus and other chemicals that would ignite upon detonation, and the idea is they would cause as much fire damage as possible, localized panic and chaos, and that may have been then ahead of heavy bombs being dropped in the area. And it's worth mentioning, if these are kind of items landed on debris in the war, on building rubble, again, because they had very little impact, they often didn't detonate, and we still find them in areas where blitz rubble was relocated to other parts of a city or an urban area to infill bomb craters. And it's just worth bearing in mind from the photo there, they're about the same size and a very similar colour to a metal scaffold pipe. So again, if you're looking at demolition waste, if you're looking at made ground, it's just worth checking to see whether it is a scaffold pipe that your operative is about to pick up and throw in a skip. A lot of ordnance is actually found reactively rather than proactively looking for it. We estimate somewhere in the region of 40 to 50% of all the projects we're involved with is when either a site investigation contractor, an earthworks contractor, or anybody that's undertaking some kind of excavation either puts a machine bucket into the ground or an operative starts hand digging with a spade. As you can see there, this is a couple of projects in the southeast of England. One of them in particular was the widening of the M25, where we found the item on the left, the sort of black and white bomb that's beginning to smoke. That's the chemical fusing that's actually burning off. That contained, again, a phosphorus containing compound, and when it was exposed to fresh oxygen, the fuse started to ignite again. We quickly assessed it. We could tell it was incomplete detonation of the fuse, and the bomb was left there for the fuse to continue its burning until exhausted, and then we would remove the item. A similar project, as you can see there in the bucket, it's quite a large item. I believe that's a 250 kg bomb, but it doesn't really stand out even as it's been excavated. brown metal to start with, it's rusted, it's corroded, it's got contamination from soft soils and gravels on it. It could be quite easy that the excavator driver wouldn't necessarily spot that until he starts to empty his bucket. And again, you know, would you detonate it by dropping it? There's a little bit of potential, but it's not significant. The two central slides show the tail fin of a bomb. Very rare that you actually find those. They tend to be torn off from the item when it's dropped and it hits the ground. But again, if you find one of those, it's a good clue that you will find a piece of ordnance as you continue excavating, and you should maybe stop excavating at this point. So that's just set the scene on why UXOs are still a risk to the industry, but the good thing is they are very, very unlikely to spontaneously explode. It would be very rare for a field that wasn't being worked on, a bomb that was dropped 75 years ago, just to suddenly trigger. They do require some kind of contact or event. The thing is, and I've alluded to this earlier on, the construction industry can provide that kind of impact. It could be the excavator of a machine, it could be sheet piles being driven into the ground, it could be rotary piles or some other kind of geotechnic works. It could even be that the item is several meters away from where you're putting these vibrations into the ground, but they travel through the ground and again trigger the item. There is potential for a clockwork fuse to be restarted, but again it's highly unlikely. The impact of hitting the ground, traveling at great speed, tends to destroy the clockwork fuses, and that's why they haven't initiated. But there are a couple of instances of that. And as we can see from the previous photos, initiation of chemical or explosive fuses is a distinct possibility. We've either exposed the chemicals to fresh oxygen, or maybe some groundwater or other water has got in there, washed some debris off, and that's allowed the two chemicals to contact each other again. And then finally, sympathetic detonation. If you find one item, there's always a possibility of finding a second, third, or multiple items, and if a controlled explosion is undertaken without searching the area further, again the shock wave from those explosions are going to be quite significant, and they would have the potential to detonate anything else in the immediate area. So what are your legal responsibilities as construction professionals on a project? Well, everyone has various responsibilities under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. Then more recently, the Corporate Manslaughter and Homicide Act has been brought in. So if somebody is injured or somebody is killed, you would have to prove that you've complied with the guidance or the regulations accordingly, and that you took every step possible to mitigate this risk appropriately. Again, under the CDM regulations, construction professionals have very specific duties, but under none of these regulations or guidance will you actually see a paragraph or a clause saying you must consider UXO, you shall determine whether there is a threat on site. It's all very much about managing a risk and identifying if there is potential for that risk on your site. If there is, you should take certain steps to evaluate the scale of the risk and then mitigate it accordingly. And again, UXO is only one of the risks to be considered. It's quite specific, but if you take a similar approach to how you would looking for asbestos in soil, working at height, people and plants, it's the same kind of process, which is very well established and very well followed in the UK construction sector. So which individual has which responsibility and at which stage? If the client is aware of any potential UXO, for example, he's knowingly bought a former piece of MOD land or knowingly bought a parcel of land that was heavily bombed in the war, he should be providing the principal designer with all the information he can relating to that risk. The principal designer will then undertake additional activities to research the risk further, to identify it, and to semi-quantify the risk as well. That information needs to be shared with alternative designers and additional members of the design team. It could be that the principal designer is, for example, an architect or a structural engineer, working with a separate company, a separate practice that's the geotechnical engineer or a piling specialist. Again, ensuring all the information is passed on to the other members of the team allows the risk to be designed for and maybe alternative methods proposed that would help mitigate the risk. Once the project moves out to the actual construction phase, the principal contractor takes over the risk. If risk has been identified at the design stage, the principal contractor will be made aware of that. Then it should be included in the health and safety plan during the construction phase. Everybody working on site, whether it's a visitor, whether it's a subcontractor or a member of the project team, should be appropriately inducted, and there should be a UXO specific element within the induction. The main contractor or principal contractor should have appropriately trained staff so that in the event of an item being found, they can implement the procedures accordingly. Instigate an exclusion zone around the area, control the area, reduce any panic or any confusion, and then escalate the process to the police in the first instance. There is guidance to the construction industry. As I've said, looking for unexploded ordnance is not a mandatory requirement, but if you believe it to be a risk, then best practice is to follow guidance and understand how you can deal with it. The Syria guide, C681, is the best information that's out there. It's about 100 pages thick. It was written by some consultants with a lot of experience in the area, and also there were a number of UXO specialists like ourselves on the steering committee and on the panel that helped produce this document. It's written primarily to support the UK market, but in certain areas around the world there is no guidance, and this document will travel and is well received in other countries. It isn't designed to make a non-UXO specialist a specialist, but it is designed to give you a good level of understanding so that you can follow the processes, you can understand the information that's being provided by your specialist, and also if you are getting involved with a peer review of somebody else's work, again, you can understand and follow the step-by-step guides to make sure that no points have been missed or nothing has been overlooked. The risk assessment for the ordnance should be undertaken at the absolutely earliest stage it can be. It should be when the project is still on the design table. It should be on the CAD screens rather than after the ground investigation may have started or after the actual construction phase has started. That's not always the case. The preliminary risk assessment, which is the very first step in the Syria guidance, doesn't have to be done by a UXO specialist. If you are a competent construction professional, that allows you to undertake this. And it can be as simple as, was my site bombed? Was my site an old military area? No, there's no evidence to suggest this from maybe a few minutes Google searching or looking at historic information the client may have provided. And if you cannot find anything that indicates there's a risk there, you can record that, write it in the health and safety folder. We've evaluated the UXO risk. We don't believe there to be no further action required. If, however, doing this initial screening, you find something that suggests, yes, the site has been bombed, yes, I believe there could be some kind of UXO threat here, then that's when you would have to go to a detailed risk assessment. But again, as long as you sort of considered a lot of the information that's on the screen, military records, wartime bombing records, and a lot of this information is available in the public domain, and you've recorded it, that's all you need to do at this stage. If you're not confident that you're looking at all the right records, or you're not confident that actually you want to sign off that there's no UXO risk on there, a company like ourselves would be more than happy to support you. There's online tools. We operate a website called bombrisk.com, which has just been shortlisted for the Business Innovation of the Year in the Construction News Specialist Awards, which I'm very pleased to say. It's an online tool. You can access it 24 hours a day. You can put the postcode in of your site. You can draw a polygon around where your site is, and virtually instantly, within a number of seconds, the BombRisk tool looks at over 100 different databases related to UXO information and would then identify the risk level associated with the site. And a couple of our competitors will also do your preliminary risk assessments, and they generally turn them around within about 24 hours. So they're all, wherever you go in the industry, it's quite rapid, it's quite inexpensive to do, and it gives you a high level of accuracy and of reassurance. And this is just a little bit of an explanation of the preliminary risk assessment. We would look at British and Allied UXO risk and also German UXO risk as two distinct items. The German UXO risk is typically large, heavy items, and they're going to be in a deeper zone. The British and Allied UXO risk is going to be the small items weighing a couple of kilos and will typically be in the top meter and a half. So again, you can take a very different approach if you're looking for hand grenades in the top meter compared if you're looking for big bombs at 15 meters down. And the information that the search in this case has found is that the site was within 10 kilometers of 3 military airfields, 5 bomb decoy sites, 2 known and recorded abandoned bombs, and there were a lot of bombs in the Second World War that the air raid teams couldn't make safe immediately, either due to their location or the fact a big raid was still being undertaken. These bombs were recorded with the intention we'd go back at a safe time and remove them, but unfortunately it's estimated there's still about 1,000 in the ground in the UK known, and possibly as many as 10,000 items of ordnance that were never recorded due to the conditions that the air raid teams were working in at the site. Also, you'd see on there was 81 World War II defence-related positions, so again that would trigger the potential for Allied items being there, heavy anti-aircraft batteries, and a number of other factors as to why the site is the risk level it is. So if your own or a UXO specialist has suggested that the risk level is higher than low or negligible, a detailed risk assessment should be carried out. At this stage, this has to be done by a UXO specialist to meet the recommendations of the Syria guidance, and it really builds on all the historic information presented in the preliminary risk assessment. But at this stage, we start to add project-specific information. What are the construction methods? What's actually going to be built on the site? Is there going to be a large cut and fill exercise for the earthworks? Are there going to be deep pile locations? Are there going to be substructures put into the ground and require significant excavations? What are the ground conditions? Soft soils, alluviums and clays, bombs can penetrate a lot deeper than stiff soils, than gravels and bedrocks. History and past use. Was the site damaged in the war, but can we find evidence that actually the site was rebuilt in the 1950s or 60s or even later? Can we start to reduce the potential risk because we know there's been a lot of activity on the site? And again, what we would do is the preliminary risk assessment identifies a lot of factors. Hopefully the detailed risk assessment starts to remove all these to downgrade your site for the risk level. So I've mentioned a lot of historic information as being key to understanding your risk. The First World War information is quite limited. We weren't really prepared, and a lot of it is quite ad hoc. By the time we get to the Second World War, we were very much better prepared. Every major urban centre had its own air raid teams. They had forms to fill in. They were issued with cameras so that they could record things in real events. They had maps of the towns provided to them, so a decent scale as well, so that they could plot where bombs landed, where explosions had gone, and they were tasked also with recording the items that didn't go off. So Second World War information, much better, allows us to do a lot more detailed assessments. Historical photos can be worth their weight in gold. You can see exactly the level of damage at the time, and also at this stage the RAF started overflying the whole of the UK, and that's been continued on a 10-year cycle. So again, we can look at possibly a ruined area or a bombed area from the war, and then we can see in the 50s, the 60s, the subsequent development that may have undertaken. Again, I mentioned sort of the bomb plots. Very critical here that we understand the dates that the bombing was undertaken and understand that the key that was used. As you can see on the central picture in the middle on the bottom, green hashes, that was where clusters of incendiaries were dropped. Very difficult to plot exactly where each one landed, so they just hatched the whole site. On some of the other pictures you will see red dots, blue dots, black dots, purple dots, and again these would be related to a specific item of ordnance. The only downside was, due to scarcity of resources at the time, not everybody was issued with the same colour pens, and some people plotted them in different colours. So again, really understanding the information in front of you to make the right kind of judgments and assessments. A lot of cities started planning how they were going to rebuild the war even during the middle of the war. So county surveyors, city surveyors would go out and undertake surveys of various roads. And typically the darker the colour, the worse the damage. So the purple and the blacks in the top left-hand corner, very, very extensive damage. The areas with no colour in, they got away with very little or no damage. So again, we can use that kind of information to say that if, for example, your project was on Wood Street on the left, very heavily damaged, higher risk. If your project was at the north end of King Street where the red square is, very little likelihood that actually your project was ever damaged. So again, we can start to downgrade the risk. We have discussions with some of our clients about records that were taken in the 40s. It's very difficult in this day and age not to assign 21st level of accuracy to things. We're very used now that people can pinpoint things. We can use GPS, but back in the war, often these raids were done at night. Often the air raid team would be several streets away from where the bombs were dropping. And so it was a best guess. We will always work on there being a little bit of a buffer zone around the locations to allow for this inaccuracy. Also, things like communications were very different to they are now. The air raid teams may have had access to 1 or 2 phones in their borough. They certainly didn't have personal items, and they would often be trying to phone in reports in real time. A bomb strike in the area could take out the phone lines. They may not be reinstated for a week or longer. So again, they may have a to-do list of we need to record this information and pass it on, but it never actually happened. And then the final thing to consider in the war era, obviously we're in a state of conflict. We're paranoid about there being spies, about there being double agents operating in the towns. So a lot of strategically important sites had their own air raid teams, and they wouldn't record onto maps that were then available to the public. So as you can see here, Surrey Commercial Docks on the left, it looks like only the surrounding areas were actually hit by bombs. There's no evidence of bomb strikes actually on the site. But if you actually compare it to the county surveyor's map, we can see that lots of black on there, lots of purple, lots of red. The place was absolutely flattened. So again, making sure we're looking at several different series of information to ensure that we're getting the whole story. Very similar again for a military base, that's Devonport Naval Dockyard down in Plymouth. Again, all the bombing records suggest that it was actually not hit, but we know from other records that actually it was a lot of damage actually sustained. So the detailed risk assessment should be unbiased and repeatable. All the stages, all the information that we've used will be recorded to allow you to assess the risk rating that we've provided at the end of the report. If it's a complex site, it may be a zoned risk map. It may be that certain areas of the site we believe are higher risk, but generally the site is actually quite low risk, or vice versa. And again, this will be very clear within the report. And dependent on the risk, we would also be then making the risk strategy and how you could mitigate that going forward. If you're doing deep, intensive work in an area of high risk, we will make a series of recommendations. If it's a low risk, the only recommendation we make could be that the site has a toolbox talk specifically related to UXO, so that should you come across an item later on, you're aware it's ordnance, the project stops until the ordnance is removed or made safe. This is a very good slide just to graphically show you the type of ordnance you may find and the type of depths that you might find it at. I alluded earlier on that the small items that the Allies used for defensive mechanisms are always, or more typically, found in the top zone, in the made ground, or within sort of a couple of meters of the surface, and then the bigger, heavier items tend to be deeper. They're traveling with much more momentum when they hit the ground and tend to go deeper. You will see some of the big items there are shown that they've gone through a curve and that they're actually pointy end up. And this is a phenomenon known as the J-curve. It's not just that we've got a lazy illustrator and he's struggled to get all the items in. When a bomb comes down and it's maybe not being dropped from the correct height, or maybe it's being dropped at quite a shallow angle, there is potential for the phenomenon of the J-curve. And this is when the ground beneath it is denser and harder to penetrate than the ground above it. It's coming at a slight angle, so the bomb can travel horizontally as opposed to vertically. And it can travel maybe 3 to 4 times its horizontal travel compared to its depth. So maybe 2 or 3 meters deep can turn into 6 to 8 meters horizontally. And there are cases of buildings where bombs have been found under them, even though the building was never hit. And the photo in the right is a domestic property in East London, and they were doing a basement extension, and they came across a metal object. The contractor said, "I believe this to be a bomb." They called out the bomb squad from the Royal Engineers, and what had happened there is their street had been completely untouched in the blitz, but the street behind it had been absolutely flattened. And it's believed the bomb landed on some debris. There wasn't sufficient resistance to cause it to detonate, so it penetrated into the ground, skidded along under the surface before ending up under this individual's house. So he'd been sat there for 70 years in his house, or the house had been occupied for 70 years, and all the time there was a live German bomb in the basement. So just to finish with a quick case study, this is an example, a live example of a project down in Portsmouth, and there's an unusual site boundary there because down in the left-hand corner of the red outlined area, we've got a very significant development going on. It's a 20-story high residential building, but on the ground floor there's going to be commercial and retail outlets, and as part of the planning they've had to put junction and infrastructure upgrades there to get through the planning process. So the long tail to the north and to the east are junction improvements and road realignments. The design team have originally come to us saying, "We know the area was heavily bombed during the war. We'd like you to undertake a detailed risk assessment." There was no point, well, that was their preliminary risk assessment. They just knew the site was bombed, and that was sufficient to trigger the detailed risk assessment. So we've plotted the site boundary onto the old historic maps, and as you can see, yep, an area that got absolutely peppered. We can see that pre-war there were a lot of houses there, back-to-back terrace houses. You probably can't see on the map there, but there was a couple of factories, a couple of churches, schools. You can see after the war there's a lot of white space. A lot of the housing, a lot of the schools have been absolutely obliterated. So again, identifying that there's a high level of risk of there still being unexploded ordnance on the site. We can also start to look at the aerial photography of the time and post-war, and all those orange shapes are effectively missing structures. So rows of terraced houses that have gone, a couple of factories. So again, you know, evidence that the area was subject to a real pounding. Then we start to look at the aerial photography and the maps post-war, so in the 50s, 60s, up right through to current day. We can even use things like Google Earth to see what the current development stage is on the site. And we can also try and estimate from the height of the buildings what kind of foundation depths they may have had, and what kind of zone has potentially already been cleared, and therefore what is the current risk level at today. Oh, sorry, there's a duplication of slides. So this allows us to create quite a complex and involved risk map, but ultimately very good for the client, because rather than saying the whole area is high risk, we've managed to de-risk certain areas to low and to medium. So we're not encouraging him to spend unnecessary cash or waste project time at this stage. So we've got the green zone, and talking you through the roundabout and the road realignment to the north. This is an area where it's only going to be shallow construction, maybe digging down to about 1 metre. The road is going to be realigned, curbs are going to go in, upgraded services. So that zone has probably been worked and reworked several times since the war. So the chance of finding any ordnance at this stage is actually quite slim. But what we would recommend is a toolbox talk to the guys working in that area, so that if they find something long, thin and metallic, maybe pointy at one end, they can decide, actually I believe that to be ordnance, so we need to escalate and implement the processes. We will move away from there, we won't handle it, we won't get curious. Things have a habit of maybe detonating when people start to handle them or get a bit curious and investigate further. But that's all you really need to do at that site, or sorry, at that location. Then we've got a couple of amber zones where we've actually identified there's a slightly higher risk. We're talking maybe a medium risk now. And this can be, we've got deeper excavations, maybe manhole chambers, maybe substructures, maybe foundations for a retaining wall, or some kind of structure is going in, and we might be digging down 3 or 4 meters. But again, still in an area that's not massively high risk. So again, we would still recommend a toolbox talk, and maybe having an EOD engineer on site actually to monitor the excavations. Syria guidance always recommends a proactive clearance if possible, but sometimes having somebody on site monitoring the dig and clearing things reactively as they occur can be a perfectly valid method. The benefit of having an EOD engineer, explosive ordnance disposal engineer on site, is that if anything comes to the surface, or we find anything in the excavation that is metallic, in real time they can assess what it is. They may be able to tell you that it's an old bike frame, it's a length of steel reinforcement, remove the item and the works can continue without any disruption. Or they may say, actually this is ordnance, I need to instigate a 20-meter minimum cordon, and we will escalate this to the police. If you ever find ordnance, even with a contractor like ourselves on site, the first instance is always phone the police. The police will have a team to cover this kind of eventuality. They then inform the Ministry of Defence, who will assign a bomb team to come to site, and dependent upon the level of risk, that might be immediately, or it might be within a day or two, or it could even be longer. Once the site has stopped because of an ordnance being found, often that area or maybe the whole site cannot be worked upon until it's clear. So if you get a week's delay until the bomb squad turn up, it can be have an impact on the project, both financially and in terms of delivering the project on time. Then finally, the red zone. This is an area where we're going to be doing a lot of deep piling in a zone that's never been cleared post-war. And there's no way to reactively clear that. You can't look ahead of a pile going into the ground down to 18 meters. So what we would do at this stage is we'd actually insert a probe into the ground, a sophisticated magnetometer, which is effectively a highly accurate metal detector, and that would go down as either to the maximum bomb penetration depth or to the pile depth, and it can produce an area of 2 meters diameter circle, so about 12 square meters from each survey, and we would assess whether there was anything magnetic in the ground that could be ordnance, or whether we can provide clearance ahead of the piling going ahead. So again, different kind of risk level on site, different kind of mitigation measures that we would take, and different costs or impact to the project. That's our contact details. We do publish a lot of information on LinkedIn about fines or updates to the guidance and things like that. So we'd be delighted for you guys to contact us, or to speak to Groundsure to get a preliminary risk assessment. Are there any questions at this time? Okay, I see the first question is a lot of acronyms. I do apologise for that. With it being a quasi-military area, the guys in green do like a good three-letter acronym. So I'll just recap on some of the ones I've mentioned today. UXO, Unexploded Ordnance. EOD Engineer, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. PRA, Preliminary Risk Assessment. DRA, Detailed Risk Assessment. CDM, Construction, Design and Maintenance Regulations. I think that's the ones I've probably referred to more times. If anybody's got a specific one, again, send the question through and I can answer that. The next question is a bullet point summary if ordnance is found. If you haven't got a UXO specialist on site, there's one point to this summary, and that is, well, it's 2 points, sorry. Call the police and evacuate the area to what you would estimate to be a safe distance, and always err on the side of caution. If you have a UXO licensed specialist on site, the first point is immediately listen to those guys when they instigate the cordon around the item, then phone the police, who will phone the bomb squad. The bomb squad at this stage would probably phone the UXO contractor for information. What do you believe the item is? Where is it? What condition is it in? Is it leaking? Is the shell casing broken? Is it, has the chemical fuse started to trigger? And again, then, dependent upon that information, will determine whether they come out to you with their blue lights flashing and are on site within an hour or so, or whether they may turn up the following day. Just to go back to the Bath example, that was a 500 kilo bomb found within a metre of the ground on a school playing fields, and they didn't turn up. We found it at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the Thursday. They got to site 10 o'clock on the Friday morning. You may have thought, actually, that's, a big bomb, significant risk. They'd be out there straight away. We had a long conversation with them. There's no evidence of any damage to the item. There was no immediate risk. They asked us to guard it until they turned up the following morning with 2 qualified EOD engineers, which we did, to make sure nobody accessed the site, nobody accessed the immediate area. And again, they perceived that was perfectly acceptable, and they turned up the following morning. And then finally, the main contractor will have written, or should have written, a suitable plan for how they would manage things. They would have various muster points on site, and everybody should be evacuated according to that plan. Another question here is, what's the difference between ordnance and a bomb? A bomb is typically a large item dropped from an aircraft. Ordnance is a cover-all term that includes things like machine gun rounds, pistol rounds, anti-aircraft shells, tank rounds, hand grenades, mortars, even things like the Home Guard were issued with things called a SIP grenade, which is self-igniting phosphorus, which was basically a glass bottle with an explosive content and a lid on it. And even those items fall under the definition of ordnance. So ordnance is much more of a cover-all term. Any last questions? Okay, thank you very much for your time today. I'm going to hand you back now to Fraser.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Philip. Very, very interesting presentation. I've heard versions of this a number of times. Always good to see the number of people that do sign up and listen and who contribute with questions as well. Particularly interesting about the J-curve phenomenon and what happens with ordnance or bombs dropped from different heights. Leave it for me then to sign off. As Philip alluded to, you can, if you have a project in mind, you can get a preliminary UXO report through your Groundsure account. If you have an account, obviously just log in as normal, and the UXO report is under the reports tab. If you don't have an account, it is free to register for an account and free to use the platform until you wish to make a purchase. So do feel free to sign up and have a look. at the options that are available to you. Once again, thank you very much, Philip, for your time, and I look forward to hearing feedback from you all, and I also look forward to the next session. Thanks very much.